Basically, if there was a fire, I'm saving these. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife, and today I'm going to take you through 10 books that I absolutely will never part with. Some of these aren't actually physically here with me because I treasure them so much. They are back at my parents' house. But these are 10 books that I would keep with me pretty much the whole way through my life. I have already done a version of this where I spoke about the 10 Irish books that I would keep. So to keep it kind of balanced, I'm not going to mention any Irish books or any Irish authors in this video, but do know I would also keep all 10 of those as well. Let's start with something that goes way back to when I was tiny, and I mean smaller than I am right now. I absolutely loved the Alfie and Annie Rose Treasury by Shirley Hughes. Alfie and Annie Rose were like a huge part of my childhood. I had 2 of their books, I believe, but the one that sticks out in my mind the most is the Alfie and Annie Rose big story books. It had stories of Alfie getting a new rain mac and Alfie locking himself into the house while everyone was locked out of the house, and camping overnight with like a little tent outside in his backyard. I absolutely loved those books. I treasure them so much, and if I ever get a chance to go back and read them, it's always like a little lovely reminder of when I was 3 years old and there was genuinely nothing worrying me in the world. I loved these books so much that I actually named a pet after Alfie. I used to have a cat named Alfie for 10 years, and that is exactly where her name came from. Yes, I know that her name was Alfie. Yes, we did think it was a boy. Yes, it was a calico cat and we should have known. Next up on the list is kind of a big one for me, and it is one that I've mentioned a couple of times here, but it is the first chapter book that I ever remember finishing by myself. Matilda by Roald Dahl. I was a big Roald Dahl fan when I was younger. I had, again, a Roald Dahl Treasury, which had 3 books in it, Matilda, the BFG, and George's Marvellous Medicine. I had loads of the little books around my house. My dad used to bring them home from school, from the library, a lot for me. And Roald Dahl was a huge part of my childhood as well. Matilda, however, was one of the first books that I ever remember finishing cover to cover by myself. I then went on and read loads of his other books, like Danny the Champion of the World, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like the BFG, and there are so many of his stories that I treasure still to this day. I've often gone back and just read them back myself or listened to the audiobook. The audiobook of Matilda is actually narrated by Kate Winslet, and she really does bring so much energy and love to the performance of this book. It's amazing. I've also read audiobooks recently of George's Marvellous Medicine, of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, of The Witches, of Easy O'Tort. I'm pretty sure I read The Giraffe, the Pelly and Me recently as well, but if there was any one Roald Dahl book that I would keep forever and ever, Matilda has to be it. Next is another author who absolutely dominated my bookshelves when I was younger. Another British author, another British children's author, and this was Jacqueline Wilson. There are, again, so many Jacqueline Wilson books that I could have put on this list. I could have put on The Dare Game, I could have put on The Story of Tracy Beaker, The Illustrated Mum, The Bed and Breakfast Star, but I went for a double act. I discovered the art of living vicariously through somebody by reading double act because I had always wanted to have a twin. So much so that when I was told I was having a baby sibling, I had imagined them coming out of the womb exactly the same height, age, build as me, and that we would be able to play together. So you can imagine the disappointment that 5-year-old Aoife had when she realised that's not how it works. Not only did I live through the vicariousness of having a sister, of having a twin sister, of having that really strong bond between siblings, I also got to somewhat live the fantasy of going to boarding school. I don't know what it was, but there was just something about going to boarding school that really stood out to me and that really called out to me. I'm not entirely sure what it was. Maybe it was the idea of like midnight feasts. Maybe it was the idea of like the dorm situation. Whatever it was, I was buying what they were selling. I really loved as well how separate as characters Ruby and Garnet seemed to be, even when they were trying to make themselves be basically the one person with 2 bodies. I really loved that at the end of the book, Garnet really does stand up for herself, strike out for herself, and make her own identity outside of being Ruby's identical twin sister. She has her own interests, she has her own life, And I would absolutely love to see what Ruby and Garnet are doing at the moment. And if there was ever scope for a novella, I would love to see what Garnet's time at boarding school was like. Another childhood reading favourite that I would love to keep and have stick around is a little bit of an underrated one. I've never heard of another person who's read this. Nobody else has ever discussed it on BookTube. But if anyone who's watching this has actually read these books, you need to let me know that immediately. When I was younger, I absolutely loved the Better Brown stories by Alan Alberg. This book is a little bit difficult to describe. So it follows the Brown family who are living a kind of a humdrum life and realize one day that they're not really happy with how their story is going. So in a kind of an instance of the metaverse, they go and visit the writer who has been putting their lives together from the little shed at the back of his mother's garden. And they let him know that they're not super happy with what happened. They're not completely on board with the storyline that they're going through. And they have some ideas for how to spice their lives up. Not like that. The ideas that they have are all of these events that have happened in history. There's a reenactment of the wooden horse of Troy. There's a kind of a retelling of the famous five. There's an imagination of like a forward jump where you can imagine what the eldest Brown child is like when she is a teenager. I loved this book. I've never seen it in a bookshop. It's so difficult to get a copy of it online. Thankfully, I do have one back at my parents' house in Ireland, and anytime that I go home and I'm in a little bit of a reading slump, it just takes me straight back out. Of the books that I read when I was a teenager, there are a couple of those as well that I would keep forever in a day. First one up is Christys' Great Idea by Anne M. Martin. This is the first ever book of the Babysitters Club series. In this book, you can see the establishment not just of the Babysitters Club itself, but also of the idea of Stonybrook, the community, of all of the characters, of how different they were, and all of the things that happened afterwards have such a great foundation in just this one book. You can go back and read all of the other books in the series, and they do have, like, I think their second or third chapter will always have a kind of a dramatis personae of who's who in the club, what their interests are, who they are as a person. But there is just something like that first time when you go back to it. Not only are there the straight Babysitters Club books, there's also Babysitter's Little Sister, where they talk about Karen, who is Kirsty's stepsister. They have the mysteries, they have the summer specials. There is so much in the Babysitters Club universe that could keep me going forever and ever, but there is just one book that stands out to mind. The next book that I loved as a teenager was another series that is not quite as expansive as the Babysitters Club is. While the Babysitters Club has about 130 books overall, this one only has about 10. I found quite a lot of solace in Mia Thermopolis from the Princess Diaries by Meg Cabot. I've gone back to it a couple of times already, and every time I go back there, it's just like visiting an old friend and all of her friends and just catching up on what her life has been like. It tells the story of Mia Thermopolis, who is a 14-year-old girl living in New York City. Her father has been out of her life pretty much since she was born, but he comes back on the scene one day to let her know that she is not just Mia Thermopolis, who is flunking algebra and who is vastly unpopular. She's actually the heir to a very small principality on the southern coast of Europe. This pretty much sets Mia's life into a complete spin. She has to learn how to be a princess. She has to gather a lot of grace and decorum that she doesn't necessarily feel like she has. I absolutely love so many of the side characters in this book. I feel like they are what really make the story for me, and particularly Tina Hakim-Baba. I feel like if Tina was real, she and I would be really close friends. We would have like really similar opinions on romance fiction. We'd probably like swap books back and forward with each other. I absolutely love going back to these books and remembering how I felt when I was reading them, and how I also felt like a little bit of an outsider. So I did connect with Mia on that situation. And then watching as not just Mia's life expands and grows, but also that of her friends, of her family, of her brother, and that of Genovia, the country as a whole. I absolutely adore these books. The next book that I would keep is one that I initially got as a gift from a friend of mine who said, "I think you will really enjoy this." And she was absolutely correct. She gave me a copy of The Book Thief by Markus Zusak, and it instantly catapulted itself into my favourite book of the year. I read this when I was maybe, I would say 18 or 19. I was definitely in my final year at school. I remember staying up until about 2 o'clock in the morning once to finish it with tears completely covering my face. It's one of the most impactful books I've read, one of the most emotional books that I've read in a really long time. I haven't gone back to it in a couple of years because I just don't think I'm emotionally ready for it. The Book Thief is set in Germany during the Nazi regime of the Second World War, and it is narrated by Death, who, as you can imagine, is going through quite a busy phase career-wise. You follow Liesel, the titular book thief, who is taken in by the Huberman family as an adoptee because at that time, families would take in children to earn a little bit more money from the state. Liesel has a huge love of the written word, but this is a time where books were banned, books were being publicly burned, so it wasn't particularly easy for her to actually get her hands on any of them. Over the course of the book, she does steal 3 separate books, and you follow her as to figuring out why it's these 3 books in particular, why they make such a big impact, and also you're seeing what life was like during the Second World War in Nazi Germany. I wouldn't say that this is historically accurate. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a text that you need to use if you're going to teach students about the Second World War, but it is still a really great read all the same, and it's definitely one that I am never letting out of my sight. I even went so far as to pick up a copy of Die Bücherdieben, which is the German copy of The Book Thief. You can tell that I really love this book. Let's go a bit more lighthearted, shall we? It would not be a video from me if I didn't mention this specific book. You can already guess what is coming towards you, but I would absolutely keep the copy that I have of I Heart New York by Lindsay Kelk. This was Lindsay's debut. It is the first book of the I Heart series, and it is also a book that cemented a friendship in my real life, so this one really means a lot to me. Angela Clark is at her friend's wedding, goes out to her car to pick up something, and accidentally stumbles upon her boyfriend with another woman in the back seat. She decides that she is not going to take this lying down and heads for the airport and just hops on the plane to the next available destination. Turns out that that destination is New York. Angela takes this as her opportunity to rebuild her life completely. She sets up a new career, new friends, new relationships. Everything is turned on its head for her, and I absolutely loved watching her throughout the series, making mistakes, learning from them, getting a new career, falling in love, starting a family. Everything that can happen to a person really does happen in these books. I will say that some of them haven't exactly stood the test of time, but this one really was the one that started it all for me, and I cannot make a collection forever in a day without including this one in it. The next book that I am going to keep is This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay. I know that there has been a bit of controversy about this book. I know that it hasn't always been well received, but I did really take a lot out of this book. It can be quite gory at times. There are some times that you need a little bit more than an iron stomach to get through. And I will give a mention to Emma from Drinking by My Shelf here, who sent me on a list that one of her friends had given her of the chapters that maybe I would want to skip forward. But it is a really good insight into what life is like as a junior doctor, what life was like as somebody working on a labour and delivery ward in the UK, when Adam felt like it was quite a thankless job, that he wasn't getting the recognition or the resources that he needed to do his role. At the start of 2022, this was turned into a TV series on the BBC. I binge watched all 8 episodes in, I think, a one night sitting, and it is still sitting with me through this day. There are some changes to the book. I will say one change in particular does make quite a huge and heavy impact just to how much stress and turmoil junior doctors do go through. Without giving too much away, I would say that storyline was handled with a lot of respect, with a lot of tact, and it is such an eye-opener into seeing what these people really are going through on a daily basis. Last on the list is probably the one that first comes to mind when somebody says, what is your favourite book? You know, after I've done the 30-minute dance through my shelves of, oh, maybe it's this one, maybe it's this one. For the moment, I think it's this one. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've pushed this into the hands of so many people that it would be remiss of me not to put this on a list of books that I wanted to keep forever. Monique is a young journalist, and she is sent on an assignment to interview Evelyn Hugo, who was a starlet in the 1950s and has been living quite a reclusive life in the last couple of years. Evelyn doesn't do a whole lot of press, she hasn't really appeared at any functions recently, but she has specifically and personally asked for Monique to do a kind of look back over her life, and particularly a look back at the 7 husbands that Evelyn has had throughout her career and throughout her life. This book is so much more than it seems just by looking at the cover. It is absolutely phenomenal. It was my first ever of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books. I absolutely bought into the hype of it, and I was so engrossed in this book that I spent about 2 hours of a holiday sat in a cafe just finishing this book off. I've pushed it, as I've said, into so many people's hands, and everyone that I know and I've given it to has completely fallen in love with Evelyn. Those are 10 books that I would keep if I could only keep 10 books for the rest of my life. Would you agree with any of the ones that are on my list, or what book makes your number 1 spot? Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.